Hey everybody, Mrs. Kernu here. We're going to learn a little bit more about ecosystems this week. We're going to dive a little deeper, just like we did for reading. We talked about how we were going to go deeper into scientific technology. Now we're going to go deeper into the wonderful world of ecosystems. So buckle your seatbelts, guys. It's going to be exciting. As we're talking about ecosystems, we're going to review our vocabulary. We're going to learn a little bit more in depth about biotic and abiotic factors, and also the difference between producers and consumers and decomposers and their role in the ecosystem. And we're going to look at food webs. So get ready. Hope you enjoy, and I hope you enjoy my wonderful background sounds of the rainforest, apparently. All right. So, in an ecosystem, we have living and non living things working together to survive. That's an ecosystem. A biotic factor are those living things, okay? Things like animals, plants, bacteria, they are all living. Meanwhile, an abiotic factor is non living, rocks, weather, rivers. Those are non living, but they help sustain life. They help animals and plants and other living things survive. All right, now we're going to talk about the difference between consumers, producers, and decomposers. So, a consumer is a living thing that cannot make its own food. So, it needs to get its energy by feeding on producers or other animals that eat producers. And a producer is a creature, aka a plant, that uses energy from the sun to create its own food. So, green plants using photosynthesis. A decomposer is an organism like a fungus or a bacteria or a worm that decomposes organic material. An energy pyramid is a model that shows how energy moves through a food chain. All right, we've got our next word, predator. Not the big scary guy from the movies, but I can see how he got that name. A predator is an animal that naturally preys on others. So it's pretty aggressive, fights to survive. Meanwhile, the prey or the poor victims, they are the animals that are hunted by another for food. A parasite, speaking of parasites, I made the unfortunate mistake of talking about ticks last week in our video. And unfortunately, Mrs. Carney went on a hike with her family. We maintained social distancing and spent some time outdoors. However, when I arrived home, I noticed a nice parasite crawling on my shoulder. And you guessed it, guys, that parasite was a tick. Was not very pleased with that parasite. That parasite was trying to get its nutrients from this lady and wanted me to be its host or giver of nutrients. And I was not having that. I was not going to be the host. I did not like that relationship. So, a tick is a parasite, and the host, which could have been your poor teacher, is the animal or plant in which the parasite lives. Thankfully, I was not a part of that relationship for very long. Humus is the organic component of soil, which is formed by decomposed organisms. Decomposed, they're dead. Ugh. All right, topsoil. This is the stuff I just purchased for my garden, which I can't wait to show you. Hopefully it survives. But topsoil is the top layer of soil where most nutrients for plants are found. So I need to take good care of the topsoil that's in my garden so that my plants can survive. A population, that's all the organisms of one species that make up a population. So if I go into my garden and I notice that there are a certain type of butterfly, that would be the population. Now, that organism of that one species is going to work together in the community of my garden ecosystem, which is all the populations living in the area. So the birds and the plants, all of them working together. And a habitat is the natural home or environment of an animal, plant, or other organism. It's where it likes to be. Oh, we have some more words here, guys. Niche is the role the organism plays in the ecosystem. So, what's its job? Why is it there? Heterotroph is an organism deriving its nutritional requirements from organic substances. It can't make its own food. So, an animal like myself, I cannot make my own food, so I am a heterotroph. An autotroph is an organism that is able to make its own food from inorganic substances using light or chemical energy. So those plants, algae, some bacteria, they're known as self-feeders. So an autotroph is a self-feeder. And I look at the word auto and I think of automatic. It's something it can do on its own. Autotrophs make their own food. All right, guys. So now we're going to look a little bit deeper as I move my head so that you guys can see. That's not going to work. There we go. Is that better? All right. So now we can see everything. So within an ecosystem, as I mentioned, there are biotic factors and abiotic factors. So biotic factors, as you can see here, we have a tree. We have a nice little bird going tweet, tweet. We've got a lovely little raccoon. So biotic factors are the living things in the ecosystem: plants, animals, bacteria. Over here, sorry, my camera splits. Over here, we have abiotic factors. So things like rocks and water and wind. Abiotic factors are non-living things: air, temperature, rocks. They're non-living, but they help the living things survive. They're important. Don't forget that. All right, so now I'm going to move my face again, guys. There we go. Hope that doesn't make you dizzy. So in an ecosystem, we have organisms, which is the single life form. And that life form has a job. It has the niche. It has the role of the organism in that habitat, which is where the organism and the population live. Now, remember, a population is all the organisms of one species, and that lives with all the other populations in a community. And those communities make up the ecosystem, all the living and non-living things. All right, so we have some types of biotic factors. Here we see some plant life. So these guys, plants in particular, are known as producers. And they're called producers because they can make their own food and then other things can eat it. So it's producing food for others. Give it that way. But it's producing food for itself and for others. So it's a producer. It makes things. Producers are important because it is part of that energy flow that we're going to talk about next. Next up, we have the lovely fox here who happens to be licking his lips because he is a consumer. And consumers are organisms that get their energy by feeding on either producers or the animals that eat the producers. So, for example, that fox might be licking his lips because he sees a delicious salad, or he might be licking his lips because he sees a yummy rabbit who just ate a salad. So consumer is going to dine on that rabbit or some greenery because that's what consumers do. They eat producers or the animals that eat producers. And lastly, we have our decomposers. And these fun guys like to decompose organic material. So a fungus or bacteria is going to break down organic material. So, for example, if you see a worm eating some delightful dead fruit that died in your garden, he's being a decomposer. He's doing his job. All right, so let's talk about the types of abiotic factors that are needed for survival. There are many things that are abiotic that work in an ecosystem. Just a couple examples here. We have sunlight. Sunlight is very important. It's required for plants to grow and it provides warmth to our atmosphere. Super important. We also have water. Without water, life would cease to exist. Just ask my plants. Sorry. Sorry to all my wonderful plants out there. And then the last abiotic factor that we're going to talk about today is temperature. Temperature can make a huge impact on an ecosystem and the animals and plants that live there. Animals and plants can either adapt, migrate, or become dormant in order to survive in their environment. So I like to use the example of, let's say I'm cold in my dining room. If I'm too chilly, I can adapt by putting on a sweater. I can migrate or move and go to a different room, or I could go outside. And lastly, become dormant. I could go take a nap and conserve my energy. So, in the real science world, however, if we look at, let's say, a bear, if a bear is in a colder climate, it's going to need that fur to keep it warm. So that's an adaptation, those extra layers. Migration. We know that birds like to move when the temperatures change, when the seasons change. And going back to that bear again, we know they like to take a nice long hibernation to avoid that cold. So there are different things that animals can do when dealing with temperature as an abiotic factor. All right, guys. So now we have our wonderful food chain. And a food chain is a series of organisms and they're dependent on each other. They need each other for the energy flow of the ecosystem to work. Okay. So, guys, let's start at the top here. We have our primary consumer, this bird here. All right, guys, let's start at the top. We have a secondary consumer, this lovely little bird here, and he is going to eat meat and also plant life. Okay, they usually eat primary consumers. A tertiary consumer is the carnivore at the topmost level in the food chain. So think of like an eagle, something that's going to be aggressive and really go after their prey. I like to think of tertiary as territorial, that they like to maintain their domain, they're in charge. But they feed on those secondary consumers. So the energy is going to go from the secondary consumer to the tertiary consumer. All right, now we have the decomposer. The decomposer is an organism, usually a soil bacterium, fungus, or invertebrate that decomposes organic material. It includes worms, bacteria, and mushrooms. And the primary consumer. Primary consumers are the living organisms that eat the producers or plants. So you can see, if we start with this primary consumer, the primary consumer is eating the plants, and then the secondary consumer is eating this primary consumer. The tertiary consumer is eating this secondary consumer. So you can see how the energy flow is moving throughout the food chain. All right, I'm gonna move my face again. Here we go. All right, so let's talk about the differences between heterotrophs, who cannot make their own food, and autotrophs, who do make their own food. So, included in the heterotroph grouping, we have scavengers. Scavengers are the creatures who like to go and find dead things. So, if you like The Lion King, those hyenas, they would be known as scavengers. They like to feed on dead things. Predators are organisms that prey on others. So the lion in The Lion King would be a lovely example of the predator. An omnivore is an organism that eats plants and animals. And a carnivore only eats meat. And this, my favorite little guy over here, this rabbit, is an herbivore. He's only going to eat plants. All right, so those are all included in the heterotrophs group. They cannot make their own food. Now we have the autotrophs down below. These are known as self-feeders because they can make their own food for themselves. Bacteria. Okay, there's some examples. All green plants. So we have trees, dandelions, Venus flytraps. They're going to be self-feeders. We have algae, so red algae, green algae. These are just some examples. So you can see the difference between a heterotroph who cannot make their own food and an autotroph who is a self-feeder. They can take care of it themselves. All right, so we're going to look here at a food web. Now, this is different from the food chain because a food chain is kind of like the basic process, and the food web is the interlocking of all those food chains and the overlapping, I wanted to say. So, a sample food web, if you take a look from the bottom of our pyramid to the top, we have our energy source, which is the sun. I wish that little box would go away, guys. There he is. So at the bottom, we have the energy source from the sun, which is used by the producers, okay, to make their own food. And then we have the primary consumers who are going to eat those plants. And then we have the secondary consumers who are going to eat these primary consumers. And then we have the tertiary consumers who are going to eat these guys. So the energy is moving up the pyramid. So it starts from the sun and works its all the way up to the tertiary consumers. These are just some wonderful examples. All starting with that sun. Need it. Okay, so let me move myself again. Hey. All right, so when there are changes in our ecosystem, this can really impact the way living things survive. So we have things like natural events and we have human activities, things that we as human beings have influenced, ways in which we as human beings have influenced ecosystems. So let's get started with natural events. Some examples are earthquakes, tsunamis, droughts, hurricanes, and floods. Now, these are things that naturally happen. Whereas on the other side here, we have some human activities that we should really look into. So the first one is pollution. Pollution has a huge impact on the way an ecosystem can function, as well as logging. So when people go in and cut down trees for paper or any other type of product, that can be detrimental to an ecosystem. Hunting or poaching can have a huge impact. If someone goes in, that's why we have laws for hunting. Like in Pennsylvania, there's only certain months that you can go hunt deer because they don't want things to happen to the population. We also have farming and construction can have a huge impact as well. All right, so boys and girls, I'm going to leave you here because I think we've covered a lot of material today. We're going to talk more about energy pyramids tomorrow, aka next time. And I hope that you read the article that I attached and you answer the questions. Please make sure you study those vocab cards, that you learn the difference between biotic and abiotic factors, that you look at the differences between producers, consumers, decomposers, autotrophs, heterotrophs. Make sure you understand all those terms because it's really important when we're learning about ecosystems.